Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Learn and Talk English podcast. Today we're diving into something that can be a little tricky, especially when you're learning a new language. Small talk. You know those quick chats we have with people we don't know very well? Think about it. Have you ever felt a little lost or unsure what to say in those situations? Don't worry, we all have.
That's right. Small talk is everywhere. At the coffee shop, in the elevator, even in a taxi. And while it might seem simple, it can be a bit of a puzzle for English learners, especially when it comes to understanding the unspoken rules and cultural nuances.
Exactly. So to help you feel more comfortable and confident, we're going to break down some common small talk situations, give you some useful phrases and tips, and even have a little fun along the way. Are you ready to dive in?
Absolutely. Let's start by imagining a scenario many of you can probably relate to. Arriving in a new city after a long flight. You're tired, you grab your bags, and you head out to find a taxi.
Okay, I can picture it now. I'm standing on the curb trying to hail a cab. And finally, one pulls up. I get in, and the driver turns to me and says, "Where to, miss?"
Uh-huh.
Now, that might sound a little strange if you're used to more formal English, but it's a very common way to ask your destination in a casual setting.
It is. Where to is a shortened, more relaxed way of asking, where would you like to go?
Hmm.
And it highlights how context and tone of voice can change the meaning of what we say. Think about it. How would you feel if the driver had said, "Where would you like to go, madam?" instead?
Yeah. Where would you like to go, madam? Sounds much more formal, almost like I'm in a fancy limousine, not a regular taxi. It's a small difference, but it creates a completely different feeling.
Precisely. So paying attention to these subtle cues can help you understand the level of formality expected in different situations. Now, let's say you give the driver your address and they respond with, "Sure thing." Again, this is a casual but very common way to say, "Okay," or "No problem."
Right, sure thing. Has that friendly can-do attitude. It's like saying, "I got you, no worries." I can definitely see myself using that.
Exactly. It's a great phrase to add to your vocabulary. Now, here's where the real small talk often begins. The driver trying to be friendly might ask you, "So, where are you flying in from?" This is a classic small talk question, especially for travelers.
It's a natural question, isn't it? You're in a new place and people are curious about where you're coming from. It's a great opportunity to share a bit about yourself and maybe even get some local recommendations.
Absolutely. But sometimes small talk can take an unexpected turn and things can get a little awkward.
Hmm.
Let's listen to a real-life example to see what I mean.
Okay, let's hear it.
Imagine the passenger tells the driver they've just flown in from India. The driver then says, "Really? You don't look very Indian, if you don't mind me saying so."
Oh dear. I can already sense this is going to be a bit awkward. I mean, commenting on someone's appearance like that can be pretty sensitive, even if the driver didn't intend to offend.
That's right. So how do you handle a situation like that? Well, first, let's analyze what the driver did. Notice how he tried to soften the comment by adding, "If you don't mind me saying so."
Yeah, it's like he's acknowledging that what he's saying might be a bit personal or could be perceived the wrong way.
Exactly. "If you don't mind me saying so" is a useful phrase to have in your back pocket when you want to express an observation that might not be universally agreed upon or could potentially be sensitive.
So it's like a little disclaimer, a way of saying, I'm going to say this, but I'm aware it might be a little bit out there.
Firstly. And it can be helpful in various situations. For example, imagine you're trying a friend's new dish and it's not quite to your taste. You could say, "This is really interesting, but if you don't mind me saying so, it's a bit too spicy for me."
Oh, that's a great example. It allows you to be honest without being rude. I'm definitely going to remember that one. Now let's go back to our taxi driver. He seems to have a knack for asking potentially awkward questions. Later in the conversation, he asked the passenger, "Excuse me if I'm being a bit nosy, but how old are you?"
Ah, yes, the age-old question, and one that can be a cultural minefield. In many English-speaking cultures, asking a woman her age directly, especially in a casual setting like this, is considered quite rude.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think? Have you ever encountered this kind of situation?
Oh, absolutely. It's like one of those unspoken rules you learn as you go along. And to be honest, I think it's a rule that applies in many cultures, not just English-speaking ones. It's always best to err on the side of caution when it comes to personal questions.
I agree. Now, going back to our example, the passenger in our scenario actually calls the driver out on it, which is perfectly understandable. But to the driver's credit, he quickly tries to recover by saying, "Don't get me wrong."
Okay, don't get me wrong. That sounds like a phrase that can be really helpful in those moments when you need to clarify your intentions or prevent a misunderstanding.
It is. It's essentially a way of saying, "Hold on, that's not what I meant," or "Let me explain myself better." It's a great phrase to use when you realize you might have said something that could be misinterpreted. Think about it. How could you use this phrase in everyday conversation? What kind of situations come to mind?
Let me see. Um, don't get me wrong, could be useful when giving feedback. Like, don't get me wrong, I really like the design, but I think the color could be a bit brighter. Or maybe when you're declining an invitation, like, don't get me wrong, I'd love to go, but I'm already busy that night.
Excellent examples. Don't get me wrong is a versatile phrase that can help you navigate those tricky conversational moments and ensure your message is understood correctly. Now, before we move on, I want to make sure everyone's comfortable with these phrases. Could you try repeating them after me?
Great idea. Repetition is key to learning a language. Okay, everyone repeat after me, if you don't mind me saying so.
Perfect. Now let's try it. Don't get me wrong.
Excellent. You're doing great. Now let's go back to our taxi conversation and see how the passenger responds to the driver's attempt to smooth things over.
Okay, so after the driver says, don't get me wrong, the passenger replies, well, thank you. In that case, I'm 26 years old, and what about yourself?
Interesting. Did you catch that little grammar quirk at the end? What about yourself? Technically, the correct way to phrase that would be, what about you? But in casual spoken English, what about yourself is super common. It's one of those things that might not be grammatically perfect, but sounds perfectly natural in everyday conversation. What do you think, as an English learner? Is this something you've come across before?
It is, and it highlights an important point about language learning. Fluency isn't just about knowing the rules. It's about understanding how language is actually used in real-life situations. Sometimes those informal expressions are what truly make you sound like a native speaker.
Exactly. So what about yourself? It might be a bit grammatically off, but it's totally acceptable. And even preferable in casual conversation. It just adds to the informality and flow of the dialogue.
Right. It's about finding that balance between grammatical accuracy and natural expression.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground already. We've learned about casual versus formal language, navigating potentially awkward questions, and even touched on some grammar quirks that make English so unique.
We have, and we've just scratched the surface of small talk. But before we delve deeper into other aspects like safe topics and cultural considerations, we'll take a short break.
So stay tuned. We'll be right back with more tips and insights to help you master the art of small talk. Welcome back to the Learn and Talk English podcast. I hope you're ready for more small talk adventures. We just finished dissecting a rather interesting taxi conversation, and now it's time to explore some other aspects of small talk. What do you think are some safe and interesting topics you can bring up when chatting with someone you've just met?
That's a great question, and it's something many English learners wonder about. Luckily, there are plenty of topics that can help you keep the conversation flowing smoothly. One classic and almost universally relatable topic is the weather.
Ah, yes, the weather. It's a classic for a reason, right?
Right.
It's something everyone experiences, and it's usually a safe bet for a casual chat. I mean, who hasn't started a conversation with a simple, beautiful day, isn't it? Or, sure is hot out there today.
Exactly. These comments are excellent conversation starters. They invite the other person to agree, share their thoughts, or even expand on the topic. For example, they might reply, yes, perfect weather for a walk in the park, or I know I can't wait for it to cool down a bit.
Right. It's a way to acknowledge your shared experience of the environment and opens the door for further discussion. You can easily transition into related topics like weekend plans or outdoor activities. For instance, you could say, are you planning to do anything fun outdoors this weekend? Or, I love taking advantage of the sunny weather by going for walks.
Precisely. And by actively listening to their response, you can find even more common ground and keep the conversation engaging. Now, another excellent topic for small talk, especially if you're meeting someone new, is travel. Have you ever found yourself talking about travels with someone you just met? What kind of questions did you ask or were asked?
Oh, definitely. Travel is one of my favorite conversation starters.
Yeah.
You can ask someone, are you visiting from out of town? Or have you been on any exciting trips lately? People usually love to share their travel experiences.
They do, and these questions show that you're genuinely interested in learning about their experiences, which can lead to fascinating stories, recommendations, and even a deeper connection. You might discover you've been to the same places or share a love for a particular type of travel.
Right. And even if you haven't traveled to the same places, you can still learn something new and expand your horizons. It's always interesting to hear about different cultures and perspectives. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about work. Work is another topic that often comes up in small talk, but it's essential to keep it general and professional.
I agree. It's perfectly acceptable to ask someone, What do you do? Or what line of work are you in? But it's important to avoid asking about their salary or specific job details. Remember, small talk is about making a connection, not conducting a job interview.
Exactly. Keep it light, respectful, and focus on finding common ground. You could say something like, "That sounds like a really interesting field," or "I've always been curious about that line of work."
Those are great examples. Now, if you're looking for a topic that can really spark a connection, consider asking about hobbies. Hobbies are a great way to uncover shared interests and passions.
Absolutely. You can simply ask if you have any hobbies. Or, what do you like to do in your free time? You might discover you both enjoy cooking, playing a particular sport, or even collecting stamps. And from there, the conversation can naturally flow into more specific details and experiences. What are some hobbies you enjoy talking about? What makes those conversations so interesting?
That's a great question. I personally love talking about books, movies, and music. It's fascinating to learn about people's tastes and how those interests reflect their personalities.
I agree. Those are great topics for discovering shared passions. Now let's move on to some cultural tips that can help you avoid awkward situations and ensure your small talk is respectful and appropriate. It's crucial to be aware of cultural differences, especially when it comes to personal questions.
I couldn't agree more. In some cultures, it's perfectly normal to ask personal questions right away, while in others, it's considered too forward. For example, in many English-speaking cultures, it's generally considered impolite to ask someone's age, especially a woman's age, unless you know them well. It's one of those unspoken rules that can be tricky to navigate. What are some other topics that might be considered sensitive in your experience?
Well, besides age, asking about someone's salary is usually frowned upon. And as we discussed earlier, religion and politics can be very sensitive topics. So it's best to steer clear of those in casual small talk. It's always better to err on the side of caution and stick to more neutral topics until you get to know the person better.
Right. And it's not just about the topics you choose, but also about how you approach them. Nonverbal communication, such as eye contact and body language, plays a significant role in small talk. Making eye contact shows that you're engaged, and listening while smiling and nodding convey friendliness and encouragement. What are some other nonverbal cues that you pay attention to during conversations? How do they influence your perception of the other person?
Well, for me, a genuine smile can make a big difference. It instantly puts me at ease and makes me feel more comfortable talking to the person. I also notice things like posture and tone of voice. If someone is standing stiffly with their arms crossed, it might make me think they're not very approachable. Similarly, if someone is speaking in a monotone voice, it can make the conversation feel a bit dull.
Those are all excellent points. Being mindful of your own nonverbal communication and paying attention to the other person's cues can help you create a more positive and engaging interaction. Remember, small talk is all about making a connection and creating a friendly atmosphere.
Exactly. It's about showing interest in the other person, finding common ground, and creating a sense of rapport. Even if it's just for a few minutes, those small interactions can brighten someone's day and leave a lasting impression.
That's a great way to put it. Now, before we move on to some final tips and wrap up our discussion on small talk, let's take a moment to practice some of the phrases and topics we've covered so far. Are you ready for another round of repetition?
Always. Repeating phrases and practicing out loud is one of the best ways to internalize new vocabulary and improve your fluency. Okay, everyone, repeat after me. What a lovely day it is today.
Excellent. Now let's try. Have you been on any interesting trips recently?
Perfect. And one last phrase. What do you enjoy doing in your spare time?
Fantastic. You're all doing great. Now, before we move on to our final segment, I want to address a common concern many English learners have about small talk.
What's that?
Many learners worry about making mistakes or not understanding everything that's said. It's perfectly natural to feel that way, especially when you're learning a new language. But it's important to remember that everyone makes mistakes, and that's okay. Don't let fear hold you back from practicing and engaging in conversations.
I completely agree. The more you practice, the more confident you'll become. And if you don't understand something, don't be afraid to ask for clarification. You can simply say, "Excuse me, could you repeat that, please?" Or, "I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that." Most people are happy to help and want you to feel comfortable.
That's right. Remember, every conversation is an opportunity to learn and grow. So embrace those opportunities, even if they feel a bit challenging at first.
Exactly. Now, in our final segment, we'll wrap up with some key takeaways and encourage you to apply what you've learned in your everyday life. So stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Learn and Talk English podcast. We've been having a fantastic conversation about small talk, haven't we? We've explored everything from casual versus formal language to safe topics and cultural considerations. Now, before we wrap up, I want to leave you with some practical tips to help you confidently put your newfound knowledge into action.
That's a great idea because let's be honest, the best way to get better at small talk is to actually do it right.
Absolutely. You can listen to all the podcasts and read all the articles in the world, but nothing beats real-life practice. So here's my first tip. Relax. It's just a conversation, not an interrogation. Think about it. Have you ever felt nervous or pressured during small talk? How did you handle those feelings?
I think we've all been there. It's natural to feel a bit nervous, especially when you're trying to make a good impression or practice a new language. But remember, small talk is meant to be casual and enjoyable. So take a deep breath, smile, and try to be yourself.
Exactly. People can usually sense when you're genuine and relaxed, and that can make the conversation flow more naturally. And that brings me to my next tip. Be genuinely interested in the other person. People can tell when you're just going through the motions, asking questions out of politeness, but not really listening to their responses.
I agree. Active listening is crucial in small talk. Instead of thinking about what you're going to say next, focus on truly hearing and understanding what the other person is saying. Ask follow-up questions, share your own experiences, and show that you're engaged in the conversation.
Right. It's about creating a connection, even if it's just a brief one. And that leads us to our next tip. Don't be afraid to share a little bit about yourself, too. Small talk is a two-way street. It's about finding common ground and connecting on a human level.
Exactly. Share a funny anecdote, a travel story, a hobby you're passionate about, or even just a simple observation about your day. It can make the conversation more interesting and memorable.
Absolutely. Now, for our final and perhaps most important tip, practice, practice, practice. The more you engage in small talk, the easier and more natural it will become.
That's so true. It's like any skill, the more you use it, the more comfortable and confident you'll become.
Exactly. So don't be afraid to step outside your comfort zone and strike up conversations with people you meet, whether it's the barista at your favorite coffee shop, the person sitting next to you on the bus, or even just a friendly face in the elevator. Every interaction is a chance to practice your English and hone your small talk skills.
And who knows, you might even make a new friend or learn something interesting along the way.
That's the beauty of small talk. It opens doors to unexpected connections and opportunities. So embrace those opportunities, have fun, and remember every conversation is a chance to learn and grow.
Now we want to hear from you, our amazing listeners. Have you had any funny, awkward, or memorable small talk experiences? Share your stories in the comments below. We love hearing about your real-life language adventures.
And if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new lesson.
Until next time, keep practicing your English. And remember, every conversation is an opportunity to learn and grow.
Happy chatting, everyone.